Hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this talk, the first session for this day. And we still have another one later today on bioinformatics. Hello, Nicole. Nicole, you're an expert on innovation and technology in the public sector and private public sector engagement enthusiast. So in today's session, we'll be discussing the private public sector engagement in the field of data, technology, science, mainly in sustaining and preserving peace in countries. So before we start, we'd like to remind our dear audience that this session is fully in English with French and Arabic interpretation being available. Make sure to click on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen and choose your preferred language. So before delving into this discussion, Nicole, could you tell us more about your experience in this field?
Yes, thanks, Anthony, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a great opportunity. So my name is Nicole Manger. I work at the German Foreign Ministry in Berlin. And so basically there I am the team lead on data innovation and technology in the preview section. So what is preview? Preview is our crisis early warning department that focuses on data-driven predictions, but also visualizations to really help drive evidence-based decision-making across the ministry. And as such, we also cooperate, of course, very closely with our chief data scientist and really working on a larger tech and data policy agenda for the ministry. And as Anthony said, I'm really an enthusiast about innovation and technology, and as such also working as an academic or with an academic interest closely with NYU, Harvard Kennedy School Tech, the Tech for Public Purpose program on really thinking about how to develop standards for responsible AI use together with the private sector.
Perfect. So before we discuss further the private public sector engagement, we'd like to remind our audience that they could drop their questions in the Q&A tab, and I'll make sure to pick them and convey them to you as we go. So what is the role of data, science, and technology in sustaining and securing peace? And more specifically, from the perspective of the private sector engagement, and why do we need them in this journey?
Yes, so basically, our approach is to be anticipatory and preventive. So the idea is to really de-escalate crises before they happen. And for that, of course, you need you need more evidence. You need to have the data, you need to have the predictions, you need to know what is expected to happen in like 2, 5, maybe even 30 years when we talk about topics such as climate change impact on security situations. And as such, there was a huge, how can I say, like, need across the ministry to have something like preview, a data-driven crisis early warning department set up. And so that's what happened like 6 years ago. And we do anything from like maps, interactive dashboards, prediction models, and so on. And of course, because we are a ministry and ministries are by nature, not as innovative as the private sector, and especially the startup scene and entrepreneurship, we have a huge need to be in a constant dialogue with the private sector and also form more structured and sustainable public-private partnerships.
And so who are the main actors, if you want, in the private sector in this, if you want, the sustaining and securing peace?
So it depends. When you talk about, specific products, for example, like prediction models, there are specific, like very specialized smaller agencies or startups that we collaborate on, or just larger big tech companies. I mean, even from the UN, our UN partners, there are a lot of, for example, cooperations with the Google Earth, mapping system to integrate geospatial data and prediction models, especially in conflict situations. That's really critical because oftentimes you don't have access to get normal data. So we kind of, replace that by geospatial data. And for that, you need to have, for example, Google Earth. Microsoft is oftentimes involved as well. So that's for that. Then when it comes to developing AI standards and data governance standards together with the private sector, of course, there are, academic institutions, like some foundations that are very involved in research on that. And it's our approach to really have this like very broad ecosystem of different stakeholders, academia, private sector, startups, foundations, being in a dialogue with us as government officials who make, the regulations, but really do it collaboratively.
Great. So from this multi-stakeholder approach, we do see several actors in this ecosystem, which makes it more like definitely it would yield better results, but we can foresee some challenges and risks. So what are some challenges and risks that you could maybe pin out working closely with the private sector?
Yes. Okay. So by nature, of course, the private sector is, profit-based, right? And that's not the same situation as in a ministry. So of course, addressing like on our side, proactively addressing this question of the private sector, like what is in it for them to collaborate with the ministry in the first place, I guess is a critical question to ask. And then, of course, for us also to have our policy agenda not undermined by financial interests. I guess that is a critical point as well. Of course, when it comes to specific projects and, like data sets, the question of classification, like, classified data, of course, we have to have a proper setting for those to be kind of processed by private sector entities. I mean, all of this comes into play. But the biggest issue, I guess, currently is that whenever we collaborate with the private sector, it's more on a project by project basis, and you need individual contracts. It's very inefficient because, like our resources are limited. We need to find a new private sector partner every time for each project. And what we actually need, and I hear this also from our US partners, UK partners, UN partners, a larger public-private partnership that is sustainable and structured, like forming a consortium of public or private partners and also academic partners that collaborate on a more constant and regular basis with the public sector in some form of like it could be a platform, a center, a larger consortium is kind of needed, and that's what we also see. And the matchmaking function that helps policy questions or policy makers to be matched with the best private sector partners is something that is really lacking at this moment.
So as you are rethinking, if you want your business model and how to do business with the private sector and engaging them, it's commonly perceived by the private sector, the government as a regulator and to limit innovation. So how could the private sector and the public sector work on this, on a common agenda when it comes to innovation, if they are perceived by the private sector as regulators and limiting innovation?
So a current approach we have, so we are not implementing it right now, but there are plans to, kind of be more active in this field, is to have, for example, like some loose forms of collaborations, like competitions and hackathons, to say like, okay, like we have such and such policy problem, and we bring together a group of private sector partners or startups. For example, we do this currently in Berlin with a GovTech ecosystem. Together, and we organize a competition, a hackathon, and the best startup, for example, gets a prize or a fellowship or some mentorship from the ministry to kind of then develop a proof of concept for us that is innovative and creative and, brings this fresh input into the ministry. Again, this question is, as you said correctly, like what is in it for the private sector if they believe we are less innovative? I guess it's really about communication and dialogue, and for us opening up and having those platforms of exchange that could really make a difference.
And how can you bring, if you want, data-driven research and public policy into the private sector? Like besides dialogues, how could you convince them of the impact and the value that they could get from this data-driven journey?
So, so you mean that private sector companies should
Yeah. But in the impactful data-driven research and public policy, not only, they do their own market research, but public policy and policy making, how to integrate the public, like the private sector demands and public policy and vice versa.
So yeah, we spoke a lot about how to integrate the private sector into the public sector. Now, the other way around, I guess, in the end, even if you are, a private stakeholder, profit-oriented, what you want, I guess what is at the core of the discussion is understanding that any company, in the end, acts in a larger societal context, right? And so it's in their own interest to have a functioning society in which they operate and a functioning market system, right? So I guess my point of convincing them would be it's in your own best interest for your own profit, for your own, profit-based thinking to really care about sustainable development goals, to care about climate change, to really care about democracy, engaging in transparent markets, where then also your company is flourishing better. And for that, we need data, and we need data-driven analyses.
And there, do you think, like, just reflecting on fragile and conflict areas, is there any impactful role for the private sector in this context in terms of intervention and implementation?
I guess it's very difficult because even for the government, so we always have this distinction between the humanitarian cooperation and assistance and then the stabilization projects when it really comes to peace building and peacekeeping. So in the humanitarian field, it's quite easy because it's more neutral. There's an emergency and you help, and you can do like data-driven predictions, and then based on that, you provide resources or food or shelter or whatever it might be. However, in stabilization or peace and security contexts, it becomes very political. Every intervention, every interaction from external stakeholders is already kind of influencing the political pathway, which is problematic, and it raises those legitimacy questions. Now, if the private sector comes into this, it becomes even more like an ethical question. And I leave that open to the audience to reflect on this. But I would say like it's probably a bit problematic, thing to advocate for private sector engagement in specific conflict settings. Yeah.
Yes. So the private sector by itself is not homogeneous. We do have startups, entrepreneurs, but at the same time we have micro, small, and medium enterprises and large enterprises. So how could startups and entrepreneurs and maybe MSMEs minimize the risks and gaps in this area when it comes to know the mechanisms to maximize the potential for cooperation?
Yes, exactly. So I guess for big tech companies, they have the resources to do nonprofit work. And of course, that raises the chance of them being willing to actually engage in, as we call it, societal impact projects, nonprofit projects. I do a lot with the startup scene actually, and like working with incubators and tech accelerators. And from them, you get very tough business questions like, what is even the point of like for us to cooperate with a ministry? And I guess that's a very fair question, because as a startup, you really need to prove your case and have a business plan and actually get out of this incubation phase and really make a stable company out of your business idea. And for them, I could really say, we are very interested in collaboration because of the creative and innovative input. And I guess what ministries could offer would be like mentorship, maybe even financial funding for specific projects that are, in the interest of governments or multilateral organizations. Fellowship programs, especially when it comes to startups collaborating with academia and research. I see a huge potential there as well, like for startups to pick up research ideas from universities and then transform them into implementable, business ideas. So those are, I guess, areas, mentorship, fellowships, programs, financial funding also, where we could kind of convince startups to collaborate with us more closely.
Yeah, and in this dialogue, I think there are two important players. Academia, you've tapped on this, but there's also the citizen engagement. So where does, if you want, like citizens and clients, if you want, because they are the final consumers for the private sector, fall? What is their role? Is there a role that they could play? Where do you position them in this ecosystem?
So you mean citizens as final end users of the
Yes.
private sector products?
Yes. But also because they're also the consumers of the government services as well, you know?
Okay, so I could address the later question, because in my specific context, the private sector companies would create a product for a government, in this case, prediction model, let's say, and then the government uses it to predict a crisis and then act, right, in terms of developing a policy agenda. Whereas the citizens, you know, as end users of the government products are basically, you know, in conflict situations, for example, the ones that are rescued or protected. So they have an interest in having those, you know, predictions and crisis analyses being as best as possible. And for that being true, I guess what we do a lot is like having those co-design processes. So we don't sit in the ministry developing our prediction model with our 5 data scientists, but we really go out and we co-design and co-develop our products together with the end users. So those might be practitioners in the ministry, but those might also be local, you know, agencies, like local non-governmental organizations. And we ask them, like, what are the products you need? Are our predictions, for example, correct? Can you validate them in, you know, your specific practical everyday life experience or not? And so I guess having this end user developer dialogue is also really critical.
You've mentioned before the role of international organizations and so on. So what is the main role, or if you want, does the multilateral stakeholders and NGOs serve as mediators in this collaboration and collaborative approach?
Yes, absolutely. And especially when it comes to like co-designing with the citizens in crisis affected regions. It's very weird, for example, for I guess for a German ministry to go to Kenya and say, like, let's co-design something. But for example, the UN, if you have the UN as a mediator, or we partner with, let's say, UNDP on the ground or in this specific context, that gives a lot more legitimacy on such projects. And I guess it should be our goal to really develop those platforms where, you know, we like mechanisms where the UN and specific bilateral partners, like the US is also very progressive in data-based predictions, to come together and co-design and, you know, with the citizens and have this dialogue. I guess another really important topic is local data ownership and anchorage, because I guess what we really want to avoid is us sitting in centers like New York or Berlin or Geneva, kind of analyzing data about third countries, and we kind of, you know, drive the narrative, then the policy narrative out of this data and the story, if you want, right? Determining those countries' destiny and the policy direction they go without their voice being heard. So I guess a lot of our work should be about data literacy training in countries affected by conflict. And really also, like, when it comes to data collections, having them included in the data collection
Civil
process.
society engagement.
Society engagement, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, and you've mentioned data protection. How could, like, if you would want to collaborate with the private sector on this front and data navigation, data collection, and so on, how could consumers be relieved that this data is protected?
Well,
why should they trust you? You've mentioned trust again. If you want, let me rephrase my question. You've mentioned trust, transparency, and so on. What is an enabling environment for this data science innovation ecosystem that would keep citizens, like, ensure that citizens, they do trust giving you the data, but at the same time, all the actors engaged in this ecosystem and this exercise are safe, and they do see the impact at the end of the day?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the UN, you have like every organization has their own standards and procedures, and they are strictest, of course, at UNHCR and IOM when it comes to the migration and refugee or, displacement data. And I guess that's a critical, like, core point, creating the baseline for trust is having standards, transparency mechanisms, and also protection. So we as a ministry, of course, have ours. As such, so for us specifically, we operate with open data. So we use, ACLED, for example, it's a conflict observatory, but this is all like open, transparent data that we just use and we feed it into our models. It's not data that we kind of secretly collect or like classified data that we use. So that's nothing that we do. But of course, the UN, for example, they have their internal data on migration, on migrants and displaced people. And of course, there need to be very high and transparent standards.
I have a question from the audience on why governments, they lag on the innovation front. And if they do lag, then the I'm just rephrasing it, it is in Arabic, and then the government would have the private sector, would have the competitive advantage here and could lobby when it comes to innovation and technology.
Yes, absolutely. And so I guess it's a question of culture, government culture, but also just the public sector per se has a different culture than the private sector. And private sector, like big tech companies, of course, also have a different culture than small startups or, entrepreneurs who are much more flexible and creative and, can basically also independently evaluate and develop new ideas, which a large government institution cannot do. Mm-hmm. And then you have, with us in the ministry, you have hierarchies, of engagement, it's a very standardized procedure of getting new ideas, like buy-in for new ideas, and you need to lobby for it on a constant basis. And then oftentimes, I guess people are a bit risk averse also,
Risk. Uncertainty,
yeah. And I don't know, it's a cultural question, and I guess for us in like working in ministries and in the public sector, it should be a goal to lobby internally for there's a term, intrapreneurship. You innovate inside a government institution, and you lobby for new ideas and also new work approaches, like being more collaboratively, having ideas of new employees coming in, having them heard on the same level as someone being there for 20 years. That's, I guess, still a problem in the ministry. You have those hierarchies. And I guess that's something where we can also really learn from the private sector, and especially from startups, to really have a different way of approaching work and being more collaborative. And I think this is also something where digital technology comes in, because it helps us, has risks, but it also helps us to be much more participatory and democratic. If those everyone can type in something on social media, whether you are the president of the United States or just Nicole sitting here, right? And it is heard. And if you have good ideas, they are heard by a broad audience. And so I think that's also a way of transforming, transforming power and transforming, work cultures. And
yes, so to the culture again and the perceptions. So the private sector should perceive this as a two-way learning exercise, but not only a one-way. The government is dictating that the engagement and shaping it. Yes, so it's a way of communicating this message. Another question from the audience, you just mentioned digital transformation and development. In light of the evolving digital development and the frequent misuse of private data, what are the main practices that contribute to raising confidence and privacy? You've mentioned it briefly before. I'm not sure if you'd want to expand further on this.
Well, I guess I'm not the perfect person on elaborating on this question, as I said, because we work with those open data and we have different, departments in the ministry, and even the foreign ministry is not the perfect ministry to discuss this question in our case, in the German case. But as I said, having transparent standards, communicating what the standards are, I guess is a good way to.
Let's link it to skills. You've mentioned data literacy. So the need for new skills to doing business. I think the government investing in training, reskilling, upskilling?
Yes, absolutely. So even for us, there are workshops that we organize in the ministry to train colleagues, to become more data literate, to understand what data we use, why we use those data, why we select a specific algorithm. And I think it's really important to create acceptance and trust, because oftentimes, especially when it comes to crisis prevention, we have algorithms that kind of make a selection of which countries we see at a high escalation potential and will be analyzed in the end. So basically, those algorithms make a decision, if you want, of which which countries get even government attention and policy attention. And that's a huge impact. So we should discuss much more what those algorithms are and why we build them in the way we do, and if this is the right way or not, what the potential is, and also the risks and the challenges. And also my personal opinion as a private person is to have much more of a public dialogue on this as well.
So in this complicated, interconnected ecosystem, and building maybe, if you want, a more sustainable and inclusive future, because maybe I think we do agree on this is the ultimate goal of both the private and public sector. How could we connect the dots and ensure that they are strengthened enough to drive impact, and we are all aligned around a common and a vision and agenda? So what are your concluding remarks on this?
Yeah, I guess my concluding remarks relate to this ecosystem approach that you mentioned already. So currently, there are a lot of bilateral talks, if you want. At some point, if you want to develop a specific product, you maybe engage a private sector partner, you pay them just, and that's it. And then the product is developed. But the larger question we are talking about here, this cultural change, and for governments to become more innovative and for the private sector to become more interested in social impact questions. I guess for that, we need more platforms to come together on a regular basis and to work collaboratively, and not just exchanging ideas, but really co-designing and co-developing products. And so so there is a great initiative right now in Berlin to work on this GovTech ecosystem, like government technology, And it's exactly this question, like, how do you open up governments to be responsive to private sector input, especially when it comes to technology questions? And so what they are doing is bringing tech accelerators, incubators together, having larger contracts and consortia formed with big tech companies, startups, and the public sector, and also research organizations. And they form networks. It's a network approach, And then in the end, it makes it very easy for us as a government to bring in a specific policy challenge we have. And we say, hey, we need a technological solution to this question. Can you come together as a consortium, as a network, and find a collaborative answer from a technological standpoint? Those more structured, long-term, sustainable public-private partnerships is, I guess, something that's, really a mission or a vision that I personally have. Yeah.
Yes. So just one very last question here. So sometimes the problems and the challenges are not just at a local or national scale. For instance, climate change, environmental crisis, pandemics, and so on. So there are global problems. How could you scale up this mechanism, or this, if you want, network exercise to a regional and maybe a global landscape?
Yeah, I mean, again, we are with the UN probably, or any other big international organization. I guess they are the perfect mediators to host such a, incubator or such a platform. So I think, it would be my hope to convince a group of like-minded countries and the UN to kind of form such a partnership on a larger scale. Of course, then you get into those tricky questions, like data protection. What standards do you use then? The US standards or more the European standards? When it comes to AI, ethical response of AI, especially in crisis settings and fragile settings, which standards and regulations do you want to use? And I guess that Europe actually has an advantage here because we have those high data protection standards, and it could be a chance to advocate for a European maybe a European approach or location even. But I guess the key there are the multilateral organizations to drive this initiative.
And, the developing countries should maybe invest further in this area, like in terms of building partnership and synergies around innovation, technology, and data. And by that, we reached the end of the session. Thank you so much, Nicole, for this insightful discussion. We look forward to hosting more sessions on this very interesting and timely topic in times of pandemics and increasing crises and fragmented world. Our dear audience, we will reconvene back at 3 p.m. Frankfurt time on a session discussing bioinformatics. See you.
Thank you so much.